Our second panel today is going to provide an overview of diversity and inclusion in the legal profession. Again, we'll be taking questions, which you can enter into the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen at any time. I'm now pleased to introduce our two presenters. Eugene Ho of Beryl counsels companies in all stages of their development, from startup through acquisition. He has significant transactional experience in all aspects of M&A, sales and divestitures, joint venture arrangements, commercial loan transactions, and private offerings. Regina Hurley of Beryl concentrates her practice on the presentation of clients with complex divorce and family law matters. She negotiates detailed agreements in all areas of family law: premarital, postmarital, separation, divorce, non-marital living together arrangements, and parental rights and responsibilities. And I'm now going to turn the proceeding over to Eugene and Regina.
Thanks, Susan. Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. To begin this discussion, Regina and I thought it would be important to set the stage by showing why diversity and inclusion matters, and then showing where we are as a profession in terms of diversity and inclusion. And then we'll talk about what we at Beryl have done specifically to address diversity and inclusion and some of our success stories. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So why does diversity and inclusion matter, right? Beyond being the right thing to do, studies have shown time and time again that diversity is good for business. One such study is McKinsey. So earlier this year, McKinsey released a report called Diversity Wins, which is their third in a series investigating the business case for diversity and inclusion. And what they found was that the business case for diversity and inclusion has actually gotten stronger now than when they released the first report 5 years ago. So McKinsey, what they did was they looked at data from more than 1,000 large companies across a range of industries in 15 countries across 5 continents. So we're talking from Australia to Brazil, to India, Japan, South Africa, the UK, the US, all over the place, right? And specifically, they looked at the relationship between a company's financial performance and the diversity of their executive team at such company. So McKinsey focused specifically on the executive team, as opposed to, just as an example, board diversity, on the theory that the executive team, are the leaders of the executive team are the primary drivers of company strategy and organizational transformation. So, and therefore ultimately financial performance. As a side note, McKinsey has done some preliminary research on board diversity, and they're also finding some significant correlation between financial performance and board diversity. But in any event, in this study, what McKinsey found was that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 25% more likely than their peer companies in the fourth quartile to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. And this number has actually increased substantially since 2014. So it was 15% in 2014, it jumped to 21% in 2017, and now it's up to 25%. McKinsey also found that companies in the top quartile for ethnic and cultural diversity are 36% more likely than their peer companies in the fourth quartile to have financial returns above their national industry medians. And this number has also increased, not as much, but basically it was 33% in 2017, and now it's up to 36%. And McKinsey's report also found that the higher the representation, the higher the likelihood of outperformance. Basically, there's a linear relationship between diversity and better financial performance. So, companies with 30%, women on their executive team are significantly more likely to outperform companies with between 10 and 30% women. And those companies were more likely to perform those with fewer or no women executives. So it's interesting to see that the business case for diversity and inclusion, actually continues to strengthen, at least according to this study. And, although the gap is closing, ethnic and cultural diversity continues to have a stronger impact on financial performance than gender diversity. And this might, as McKinsey has suggested in the past, be because earlier efforts to increase women representation in the top level of business has already, yielded some positive gains. McKinsey, unfortunately, was not able to sufficiently obtain data with respect to other forms of diversity other than gender and ethnic and cultural diversity, such as LGBTQ diversity or disability diversity, but I would venture to guess that greater diversity at all forms would probably correlate with greater likelihood of better financial performance. Obviously the pandemic has disrupted the business landscape in a myriad of ways, and against this backdrop, diversity and inclusion efforts can easily take a backseat. But arguably, this data suggests that companies with diverse leaders are financially more likely to outperform companies without them, and therefore more likely to survive this crisis. Next slide, please. And specifically for law firms, right? Clients are increasingly taking a firm's diversity commitment and progress into account in selecting and retaining counsel. So again, diversity is good for business. In-house counsel in particular are taking a firmer stance on diversity. In early 2019, in response to a string of partnership classes from some top-tier law firms that remain largely male and largely white, more than 200 general counsel. Originally it was 170, but a number joined on. Basically, companies representing small tech companies to large corporations like Google Fiber and Lyft and Heineken. They all signed on to an open letter that basically read like an ultimatum. It basically said, we are going to direct our legal spend to those firms that show results with respect to diversity and inclusion. And clients don't only care about just checking the box, right? They also want to make sure that diverse attorneys are working on their matters. As an example, at Beryl, we have clients that require us to basically complete a questionnaire, showing our timekeepers, broken down by certain metrics before they will even pay their bill. I will say, however, that despite this letter and what the GCs have said in this letter, it isn't entirely clear that they are actually diverting their legal spend. When Reuters reached out to the various general counsels that signed on to this letter earlier this year, which was about a year after they had signed on to this letter, only 2 companies said they dropped firms that didn't make enough efforts to become more diverse. And maybe that's pandemic related, or maybe that's just part of the problem, right? GCs aren't holding firms accountable. Next slide, please. So despite a clear business case for diversity and inclusion, the legal profession remains one of the least diverse of any profession. Some of the numbers published in ALP's 2019 diversity report are, I think, telling. Let me start by saying that, acknowledging that this data is limited, right? It deals with private law firms mostly, and not government sector, not in-house, not public interest. And not all private law firms as well, right? They don't all report. It's generally mostly the larger ones. Nonetheless, the data is helpful, I think, because it's statistically significant, right? It includes info for over, I think, 100,000 lawyers, and because it's been collected for a long period of time, I want to say it's almost 3 decades, it can show trends, if any. So let me start with the good news, right? So women, people of color, and women of color have all made gains in 2019 in representation at the associate level. So this is what this chart shows. And if you take a look at this chart, you'll see that women now represent 46.77% of associates, which is up about 0.86% from 2018. And it's basically has increased in each of the last 4 years, such that this is actually the highest percentage on record in the 27 years that NALP has been collecting this data. People of color now represent 25.44% of associates, up 1.22% from 2018. That's a big jump. Women of color now represent 14.48% of associates, up almost a full percentage point from 2018. Next slide, please. And if you look at this chart, right, this is percentage of partners that are women, people of color, and women of color. You'll see that all these categories have also made gains at the partner level. So women now represent 24.17% of partners. This is up 0.81% from 2018. So just take a step back. This is partners. This is both equity and non-equity partners. But this 0.18% increase is actually the second largest percentage increase during the time NALP has done this. The 27 years it's been reporting this data. I think it was only exceeded by the year in 2014 when growth was a little bit better. People of color now represent 9.55% of partners, up 0.42% from 2018. Women of color now represent 3.45% of partners, up a little bit over 0.25% from 2018. Not great numbers by any means, but there's no denying that they're improving, and you can see sort of the chart as it goes up, right? But let me put these numbers in context. Next slide, please. So this is a lot of numbers, but if you take a look at this breakdown by ethnicity, and let's start with associates, which are the columns on the right, you'll see that much of the increase in representation of people of color can be attributed to increased representation in Asians, right? So Asians now represent 12.17% of associates. And Latinx and Blacks or African Americans, on the other hand, remain largely underrepresented, particularly the latter group. With respect to Blacks or African Americans, you'll see that they now represent 4.76% of associates, which is again up from 2018, and again has increased the last 4 years, and finally this number has surpassed the 2009 level of 4.66%. And many of us remember 2009. That was the year after the Great Recession, where there were just layoffs all across the country, and folks that were diverse, I think it was clear, were disproportionately affected. So it has finally surpassed that 2009 level, but really it's just barely done that, right? It's done it by 0.1%, and indeed, if you look at the sort of the trends over the last decade, basically the percentage of Black or African American associates has declined in more years than it has increased. It actually fell every year from 2010 to 2015. And in addition, for Black or African American women, their level, which is I think 2.8%, right, is actually remains below the level from 2009, which was 2.93%. And for partners on the left, you'll see a similar trend. Asian American women make up 1.46% of law firm partners, which is not great, obviously. But if you look at Black or African American partners, Latinx partners, they haven't even hit 1%. Take a look at the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, you'll see that women overall, remain grossly underrepresented among equity ranks. 20.3% of equity partners being women, and even worse, people of color, 7.6%. So I don't have a slide on this, but another interesting take that I saw from the NALP data was that diversity in U.S. law firms also varies greatly based on geography. So, cities like Seattle, San Francisco, those reported the highest percentage of women partners. I think it's 29.73% in Seattle and 29.45% in San Francisco. This is the percentage of women partners, equity partners. Sorry, not equity, just partners. In Boston, I think it was 23.17%, just to put things in perspective. New York, 21.46%. Miami reported the highest percentage of partners who are people of color by far, 34, almost 35%, and women of color, almost 11%. Boston, again, just for reference, 5.37% for percentage of partners who are people of color, 1.71% women of color. New York, 10.8%, and almost 4% for women of color. So just to summarize, yes, there have been clear improvements in recent years. There's no doubt about that. Some of the numbers are historic highs, but the pace is just not significant enough. If we continue at this pace, it's going to take, I don't know, I haven't done the math, but probably decades before we reach parity. And if you break down the numbers for some of these groups, you'll see that the improvements are almost imperceivable. With that, I'll turn it over to Regina.
Sorry, I apologize about that. I'm going to put diversity and inclusion in a little bit of context here before going into the 2 points I want to make. The preliminary results of the 2020 census are in, and they show that racial and ethnic diversity is the future of our nation. In his July 1st, 2020 article for the Brookings Institute, Mr. Fry observed that the nation is diversifying even faster than predicted according to the new census data. That's William Fry, July 1st, 2020, Brookings Institute. The decade of 2010 to 2020 will be the first decade since the census began in 1790 to see a decline in the white population in the United States. During that decade, the white population in the United States declined in all of the 50 states, each one of them, and in 358 of 364 metropolitan centers. In her October 1st, 2020 article for the Pew Research Foundation's Abby Budman said, Americans are more positive about long-term rise in racial and ethnic diversity than they were in 2016. The United States today is more racially and ethnically diverse than it has ever been. Those statistics, and they're just coming out of the census that was conducted in 2020, stand in stark contrast to the statistics for law firms and the legal industry today that Eugene was just going over. I'm going to drill down a little bit into some of those statistics. And if anybody wants these articles, I can give you references to them. I apologize, we didn't have them on a slide. So some of the statistics from the 2020 census that I think are important. As of 2019, 49.95% of Americans identified as white. 13.7% of Americans identified as Black. 25.8% of Americans identified as Latinx, and 5.2% of Americans identified as Asian American. Let's contrast that to 2010, and these statistics again are all from the census. In 2010, 60.38% of Americans identified as white, 12.3% of Americans identified as Black, 16.4% of Americans identified as Latinx, and 4.9% of Americans identified as Asian American. The primary driver of the demographic change in the last decade appears to be the increased diversity among the country's younger population. In 2019, more than half of the nation's population identified as a racial or ethnic minority. The Pew Foundation study found that of that group, more than 40% identified as Black or Asian people of color. Okay, now that we've set the context, it might be a little bit easier for us to understand the critical importance of diversity in the workplace. The results of the 2020 census show that the makeup of our clients and customers has undergone a significant change, and businesses of all types need to respond to that change. Diverse and inclusive businesses, as Eugene has already pointed out, will outperform their competitors on the basis of race by 36%, on the basis of gender by 25%. LBGT is a little different because the census doesn't collect data on LBGT people. However, there is a study that was done in 2015, the LGBT Diversity Show Me the Business Case, came up with something called the diversity gap, in which 55% of respondents to a survey answered that LGBT diversity policies are important in their next job. Interestingly, though, only 23% of them felt comfortable asking about those policies in a job interview. Diverse and inclusive businesses are able to retain and are able to hire and retain diverse talent. When diverse people look at an organization with hopes of employment, they want to see that there are people like them in the hierarchy. They want to see that there are people like them in leadership, and they want to see people like them succeeding in the organization and leading in the organization. For LGBT candidates, in addition to all of that, they want to know that they're going to be safe in the environment that they are working in, and that they don't have to keep their lives a secret. If everybody will pause for a minute and think of how difficult and how much energy goes into keeping a secret, then we've hit upon something with regard to productivity. The global study I just referred to, the LGBT global study, estimates that in the United States alone, businesses could save close to $10 million a business by being inclusive of LGBT candidates as well as others. That the amount of productivity that is lost in our businesses by virtue of the fact that employees of these businesses, owners in some cases, don't feel comfortable coming out or don't feel included. It takes, as I said, it takes a lot of energy to keep a secret. Now, diversity and inclusion are not interchangeable. It's important not to conflate them. Diversity refers to the makeup of your workforce: race, ethnicity, gender, LGBT, age, and disability, and veterans. Inclusion is what is needed for diversity to thrive. Too many organizations make the mistake of focusing on diverse candidates, recruiting diverse candidates, increasing the diversity statistics on their roster, without focusing on the foundation that's needed to enable diversity. And that foundation is your business culture. You can hire diverse people, but if they're coming to a place that doesn't value differences, you're not going to keep them. Or they're not going to be as productive as they could be because so much of their energy is going to go into concern about the fact that they're not fully accepted in your culture. So here are a couple of concrete ways to foster an inclusive culture. It starts at the top. It starts with management. It starts with leadership, in particular, the leader, if there is a leader. One of the most important things you can do at the top is train an unconscious bias. And there are a lot of groups out there that will come to your office and begin a training program for you, as long or as short as you need. But training an unconscious bias is very important to any program that is going to promote diversity. In addition, an organization can have affinity groups. Affinity groups are groups where within an organization, people can come together, they can talk to each other, they can find mentors, they can find sponsors, they can feel supported. And it's also an external indicia of the business's support for diversity within their organization. Other things you can do is you can update your website. You can update your employee handbooks. You can update your recruiting materials. And when you're updating, you really need to pay attention to the language that you're using in those updates. And you need to be certain that the language reflects the diversity. When you're developing a diversity and inclusion program, you need to develop a baseline. Where are we starting? Where do we want to be? And you need to monitor the baseline, monitor your progress, and it needs to be monitored actively. In terms of how we would go out to recruit people, going to a recruiting agency or just putting an advert in the paper may get you a couple of diverse candidates. But if you really want to be diverse, one of our offices is in Portland, Maine. If you really want to be diverse in an area that might not have the diversity you're looking for, you need to affirmatively go out to colleges, universities, professional schools, and organizations, employment organizations within your city, and begin recruiting well before these people have graduated from college or from professional school. You need to really go out in a proactive way and not just wait for people to come to you. Diversity, as I said, really important. The thing that is most striking to me in this presentation and the work I did to prepare for it is the way our country has changed. And if you don't believe it, just pull out the statistics from the United States Census and see what they're telling us. The United States has changed. We are no longer a white nation. We are a diverse nation. And without fostering diversity, we're not going to be able to attract top talent, customers, or leadership. So with that, one of my favorite parts of these programs is the questions, in part because I feel that we really get an understanding for what the audience wants to hear when we do questions. So I'm going to pause there and ask if anybody has questions for Eugene or me. And Susan, are you in the chat?
Sorry, we had a little bit of a snafu with the
That's okay.
with the video. Sometimes it starts and sometimes it doesn't. So I have a question asking about what you see as the biggest obstacle to creating inclusion at your law firm at Beryl. You mentioned earlier, Regina, that one of your main offices is in Portland, Maine. Maine probably isn't the most diverse state. So what do you see as sort of the major obstacles that you've had to contend with?
I think we have offices in Maine, Westport, Boston, Maine being Portland and Augusta. We also have smaller offices in Washington, D.C. and Rhode Island. In terms of the major obstacle in Portland, it would be the lack of diversity within the state of Maine and within the city of Portland. We were talking about affinity groups yesterday, and one of the interesting statistics, I guess, that came up is that there are no law firms in Portland that have affinity groups. And so again, creating that culture of inclusion and realizing that you want your firm to be a reflection of your community, but if your community is not diverse, and if the folks who are coming to you for services are expecting a diverse workforce, and the people who are coming to you for services as clients want to have a diverse team, you're going to have to go out and find those candidates. One of the things we've done most recently, this will be our second summer, is we founded a program in Portland for 1L students. It's a diverse program. We have paired up with 2 other law firms to take 2 2L students into each of our firms for the course of the summer. And the 2L students, or 2 1L students, are diverse students. So we're trying to do that. In addition, we have broadened our on-campus programs in terms of interviews to seek out schools that might have a larger percentage of diverse candidates. I'm a daughter of the South when it comes to law school. I went to law school in Louisiana. I'm a big proponent of going to the places where you're going to find the candidates. So I think that would be probably the biggest hurdle we face, are just the sort of demographics of where we're located. And Boston might be better than Maine in terms of demographics, but it's still has a lot to be desired. Eugene, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, just one thing to note is that because we're a smaller office in Boston, for example, right? There's when we look at numbers, it's hard to just, when you're a smaller office, look at straight numbers and measure success that way. So that's I think an obstacle. And I think what we as a firm have tried to make sure we do is really be more intentional. It's not all just about numbers. It's about making sure that we're recruiting and retaining diverse attorneys. And when we have diverse attorneys at the firm, really making sure that they're having the tools to be successful. And one of the things I think that we've done very well, for me at least, is really supporting me with respect to affinity bars. You know, I'm a big advocate of affinity bars, probably because of the way it's helped my career. And so the firm has been just really supportive of me in that. And I think it's an underappreciated way to address diversity and inclusion, because I think when we all work together, you know, when you have a smaller office and you don't have just the numbers to create that affinity, you can support in other ways to help folks find that affinity outside of the firm, and really, you know, develop a better network, develop better mentors, find leadership opportunities in these affinity bars. And that's one thing that I think we've been pretty successful at.
So could you advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So Beryl has had a very good record of success with increasing their diversity in terms of gender. And I was hoping you would both maybe talk a little bit about how that happened, how you were able to make that a reality.
Beryl had the first female managing partner in New England. 1992, Judy Coburn stepped up to managing partner. That was just slightly before Regina Pisa over at Goodwin. I've thought a lot about this because we do have some pretty significant numbers when it comes to both firm management. The executive board last year was female, all female. We had one male join us this year. We have a high priority, or high percentage, as you can see, of equity partners and non-equity partners. I think part of it is we just value talent. And one of the sort of anecdotes I use to explain this is back in the late 19th century, when men were generally the only people who served as stenographers. We had a female stenographer that we used. It was the only female stenographer in Maine. It was the only firm that wanted to use a female stenographer, but she was the best one, so we used her. And I think a lot of that has to do with just using the best talent that's available. And we have also had affinity groups for women in terms of, you know, women's lunch groups getting together. But I think it's also been a positive and inclusive atmosphere for women. We've got a reduced hours work policy. We don't give people a hard time if they want to take it. If you want to reduced hours because you want to be at home with your children, you can, either mother or father. I think Eugene had a little experience when you had your first child with some of that as well. But I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Regina, as I understand it, I wasn't around, but you know, the firm hasn't always been, you know, great on gender diversity, and there was a time when the firm was seeing a lot of women leave the firm, and as I understand it, and Regina, you may have spearheaded this, but you know, basically the firm saw this as a problem and was very deliberate in how it attacked it, and basically did interviews, you know, of all the folks that left, and probably the folks that didn't leave, and just try to get really candid answers as to what was going on. And through that process, they were able to identify issues and address them and make this a priority.
That's absolutely right. And these were interviews that were conducted well after the female attorneys had left. Everybody does an exit interview when you leave a firm, but this was something that we looked around, we didn't like the numbers. And so the diversity committee affirmatively went out to each of these attorneys and said, we want to know what the real story is, if there's a real story. And that was very helpful to the diversity committee in addressing some of the needs that female attorneys had within Beryl. You know, Affinity Group was one way of doing it. Other ways of doing it were just educating other people about what it's like to be the only woman in a hall of men who are all going out for a beer after work. You know, the guys weren't thinking they were excluding a woman, but you know, essentially when they all go off as buddies and they don't include somebody. So by educating people about what that feels like, we found that there was a level of inclusion that developed that hadn't been there before as well.
So we have a question about, really it's about retention. The question is, recruiting associates and staff is important, but how important is it to diversify the ranks of partner? And I think what the question is getting at is something that I think, Regina, you talked about earlier. It's not just about diversifying, it's making people feel included so that people stay. So can you talk a little bit about what can be done to improve retention?
What can be done to improve retention is to let people know that there's a path forward and a path up. I mean, a lot of people don't want to start a job and leave. They want to come, they want to be successful, they want to see a path forward and up. So in terms of retention, we have a very active mentorship program. We have a very active sponsorship program. We differentiate between mentors and sponsors. Sponsors are the person who are going to get behind you and make sure that you are teed up for partnership, whether it's equity or non-equity, teed up for a committee position. They're the people that sort of help you move forward, whereas a mentor is somebody you can go to and say, what's up with? How do I get through this? So we take our mentorship and sponsorship program very seriously. We also have a really meaningful review program where our associates, as they're coming up the ladder, we show reviews to all of our associates. Everybody reviews whoever's working on people, and the associates get a copy of the reviews with everybody's name so everybody knows what the deal is. And if somebody's stumbling in an area, we come in and we do whatever we need to do to try to help them forward. But I think the intentionality with which we approach mentoring and sponsorship is important. I'm also going to say that the attitude of leadership from our managing partner on down is very important as well. Our managing partner has been a big proponent of women in positions of leadership and women in leading committees and partners as well. And that's been very helpful.
I think that's right. And just to add to that, you know, I think it's really a cultural shift. You know, I think some of the numbers I was showing earlier, you know, the numbers are getting better, but really without any real cultural change, you know, it's going to take forever to make a real difference. And part of what that means, and I think the sponsorship, mentorship distinction that Regina was making is really indicative, right? So I think for diverse attorneys, if you polled them all, a lot of them would probably say they have a lot of mentors. I've had a lot of mentors, and you know, part of that is the policies that firms put into place to make sure that diverse attorneys have mentors. But if you ask, do they all have a lot of sponsors? Probably not. And so I think that distinction is important in making sure that really we're being inclusive, right? Because sponsors are the ones, like Regina said, are going to be the ones that go to bat for you when you're up for partner. They're gonna go to bat for you when you're asking for a raise. They're the ones who are going to tell you things that maybe they shouldn't, right? That are important in firms, right? Because firms, at the end of the day, there's a lot of politics in order to succeed at, you know, beyond the associate levels at firms, and you need folks that have the inside information and the know-how and the you know, they can back that up to be supportive. And that all comes from, I think, a cultural shift that really, you know, everyone in the firm has to buy into. Otherwise, it's just not going to be particularly successful.
So you talked about the management team and how the management team has made it clear that they consider this to be a priority. Can you offer some advice for some of our attendees on how you can get upper management's buy-in? How do you convey the urgency of this and get upper management to support and buy into the need for diversity and inclusion?
Want to take a crack at that first, Eugene?
Please.
Well, Upper management, you have to have an ear. I sit on our firm's executive board. I actually chair it right now, and you have to have an ear. You have to, and when you have the ear, you've got to use it. And to get upper management buy-in, first of all, the business case is absolutely imperative. You need to explain that your clients are out there and they want to see diverse work teams. They want to see people of color. They want to see LGBTQ people in their workforce. They want that diversity. And so you really need to make the business case for it with your management team if they're not understanding it. There needs to be education. And the education that I spoke of earlier, whether it is with unconscious bias, or we had this spring, maybe in June, if I'm correct, we had the Racial Equity Institute come into the firm, and we had a firm-wide town hall where I think it was about 2 or 3 hours, where we listened to a presentation essentially about what it's like to be somebody who's not white, and trying to get into somebody else's shoes. Programs like that are very helpful as well. You basically have to have an ear on management, and if you don't have it, you've got to push for it. And if your partners, get your partners to push for it.
Eugene, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, I think Regina said it right. I don't have much to add to that.
Okay. I'm hoping both of you can maybe talk a little bit about the effect that the pandemic might have had on the effect it has perhaps on diverse attorneys, and how that might be different than it is on all of us. All of us are now working from home and trying to manage that. Do you think there's been additional impact, and do you think that's something that firms should be focusing on?
It's in a lot of the impact that I've seen from the pandemic is in some cases economic in circumstances. So it's hard to give sort of a generalized answer to that question without knowing the individual economics of people. I've been very surprised through the pandemic at the number of people, including our staff, including attorneys, who didn't have home computers, who didn't have a computer at home. So that when we went virtual, we were required to essentially provide computers to everybody that didn't have one. I realized that people use their phones for most things these days. But I was surprised to see that. And I was surprised again when I'm working with a group in the courts, seeing that the courts are struggling with the same thing. So technology was a big issue for the pandemic. Isolation, if you're a new person to the firm, and we've had some new people in our firm, isolation is a very difficult thing too. If you're new, and if you're a new associate and you're trying to make your way, isolation can be very difficult. You don't get to have that one-on-one contact, that walk down the hall. And so the firm has had to go out and affirmatively continue to push the atmosphere, which would be the number of town halls that we had throughout the year, the weekly message from our managing partner, who I don't think he ever sent a weekly message prior to this point, but he got used to sending weekly messages. And let me tell you something, the staff and attorneys really appreciated it. And then the various practice groups setting up their own virtual happy hours, their own weekly meetings, daily meetings, to keep people engaged. We really went out to our folks and said, you need to go out to the people you work with, your practice groups, your teams, your assistants, and you need to check on them. You need to find out how they're doing. You need to bring people together. And so we worked very hard at bringing people together. The pandemic has had such a varied level of effect on so many different people. You can say some people didn't like the isolation, some people did. People with children had a very difficult time, no childcare, homeschooling, trying to work, 2 people in one house, trying to keep it all together. We tried to be flexible with our policies as well, in terms of when we went virtual, we said nobody in the office, but we had some members of our team that really needed to be in the office because they weren't able to do what they needed to do at home as easily. So we tried to be flexible with that as well. But I think, technology and isolation and keeping people together and talking were some of the most important things we did, and also some of the most difficult to implement.
Yeah, and I agree. And you know, I think from a macro level, you know, I think it's unclear yet, you know, how the pandemic would has affected firms economically, and what that has meant in terms of you know, layoffs and things of that sort, and whether that has disproportionately impacted diverse attorneys, like it I think clearly did in 2009. And so we'll have to see. And you know, I think hopefully firms and companies recognized the disproportionate impact that 2009 had, and I think most do, and sort of make sure that they don't put diversity and inclusion, you know, in the back seat, you know, as you know, this crisis continues. On a micro level, I agree with Regina. You know, it's you know, this is hard for everyone, of course, but you know, for a lot of diverse attorneys, when you're the first, you know, lawyer in your family, and you know, you feel left out, right? You know, being isolated in this way makes it hard. You know, I will say that, you know, a lot of the younger attorneys are you know, I think a little bit better at some of this, you know, the Zoom calls and things of that sort, and so that has helped, I imagine, with connecting with people. But you know, at the end of the day, this is a relationship built business, and we need to connect with people, and so I think that you know, for diverse attorneys who don't have as big of a network, or who don't have as many mentors, don't have as many sponsors, you know, that's an impediment that we'll see how that impacts folks. But you know, hopefully when things loosen up and we're all able to come together, you know, safely, that those barriers are no longer, and they don't have a lasting impact.
So could we go to the next slide, please? And I just want to remind folks to, you know, go ahead and put your questions in now if you have them. So this slide talks about some of the initiatives you have at the firm. And what I think would be helpful for people is for you two to kind of talk about what firms can do that aren't the biggest firms. There's some talk earlier on about firms that have chief diversity officers, but your smaller firms aren't going to be able to do that. So what kind of initiatives can they do to address the concerns about diversity and inclusion? And Beryl, I know, isn't a small firm, but it's also not a giant firm either. So if you could kind of speak to the things that you've been able to implement, I think that people would find that helpful.
I think the first thing you need to have is a group of people, whether you call it a committee or a task force. You need to have somebody that you need to have a structure for it, and people who are interested in this, passionate about it, who are willing to sit down and say, this is what we want, how are we going to get it? So I would say that having a task force or a committee that is charged with diversity is probably one of the easiest things a small firm, small office, medium firm, any firm can do. And what you do is you study it, you read about it, you get the statistics, you listen. And so I'd say that's one of the first things. Eugene, you mentioned the affinity groups within the legal community. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, just I really do think that for you know, smaller firms, or firms with small offices in certain cities, and you know, maybe solo folks, you know, the affinity bars really do provide a great benefit for diverse attorneys. You know, I can talk a little bit about how I got involved, but you know, I came to the city. I think it was 2008, and I you know, I didn't have because I didn't go to law school in Boston. I didn't have a natural legal network, and I didn't you know, I was the first lawyer of my family, you know, first generation college student actually, and so I, you know, I didn't know anyone who was a lawyer other than folks I saw on TV, right? So my natural inclination was to join an affinity bar association. And, you know, after a number of, a lot of awkward networking, right? You know, where you just go into these events just to meet folks, you start building affinity and you really start networking the right way with the folks that you're interested in networking with. So, you know, there's networking, there's mentorship, and I actually was president of the Asian Bar from 2015 to 2017 as a relatively young attorney, right? So I was given leadership opportunity. So, you know, there are ways that I think smaller firms can support diverse candidates by supporting, you know, these associations for them to get involved, because I do think they really do have a great benefit and an underappreciated benefit.
The other thing you can do, and this is fairly simple, you can be a large, medium, a small firm if you have a social media presence. Curate posts that would be interesting to people that are diverse. Comment on issues. You want to be careful how you comment, but cultivate that within your social media platform. To the extent that you're able to support things in any way, either by volunteering or by you know, providing some sort of financial support. Beryl Dana supports Pride Week each year in all of our cities. That was a very important thing. We support the Campaign for Justice. We've started this 1L program. But in smaller units, you can still do the same thing with regard to just volunteering and getting out there, being present. Volunteer for a court committee that's addressing some of these things. But those are some of the things. But I really think it goes back to, you know, coming together, having a structure to move this forward, and figuring out how you're going to do it.
Could you both talk a little bit about how a firm can sort of track its progress, right? What does one look at to see that, okay, we're moving the ball forward here, we're moving the needle, the things that we're doing are actually having the desired effect?
Let me jump in first and say one of the things that I think we need to also be aware of is we're not just talking about lawyers and law firms. When we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we're talking about the entire workforce. So one of the things you can do to mark progress is you can maintain statistics. You know, who are you bringing into the firm that is diverse, and who's leaving the firm, and why are they leaving? You can also and basically have a spreadsheet with that sort of stuff and go back. Those are some of the simplest things you can do to track your progress. Anything on your end, Eugene?
And I think it's making sure that we track them at every level, right? So, you know, you looked at the numbers, right? Associates, statistically, representation is much better at the associate level, much better at the summer associate level, right? Than the associate level, and then you know, non-equity partners and then equity partners, right? So it's making sure you track them at every level, and you know, the one that probably matters the most is equity partners, right? And taking a true look at that part of the process and whether you can make a difference there.
So Eugene, earlier on, you talked a bit about companies and how companies looking to hire law firms are looking for a certain level of diversity, and they're starting to ask more questions about that. But you did mention that, at least most recently, a lot of companies haven't really been declining to hire firms because of that, possibly because of the pandemic. Could you just talk a little bit more about what you're seeing companies looking for, and perhaps the kinds of questions that they're asking when they go to hire a law firm?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So yeah, so it's really, and these are mostly sort of the larger companies, right, where they put out an RFP process, and the questions are very pointed, right? It's you know, how many, you know, who's going to be working on this matter, and you know, what are the demographics of those folks, and you know, when you're going to pitches as well, you know, companies want to see diverse attorneys as part of the pitch, not just someone who's part of the pitch, but you know, doesn't really play a role other than just showing up in the room. And I've had those conversations anecdotally with general counsel at various firms. You you know, but at the end of the day, you know, it's hard to, you know, get insight into exactly how companies make these decisions as to who's, you know, who they choose in terms of counsel. So, you know, it's unclear necessarily if it's because of that reason or some other reasons that they decided not to pick your firm or decided to pick another firm or did decide to pick your firm. You know, I think you've hit on something, Susan, where I really do think we need buy-in from companies that have the, you know, that are the legal purchasers of services that really, you know, have teeth behind who they're choosing as counsel. I think that can make a big difference. And so folks that have the ability to pick their counsel based on, you know, how diverse or at least, you know, how much progress a firm is making in that respect can make a big difference. And it's an important part of this process of diversifying the legal profession. I don't know if Regina, do you have anything to add to that?
No, other than the, you know, the context that we're operating in right now. People, I don't know if people are really aware of how much this country has changed demographically, but that's the reason we need to have this change, because we're different. We're changing. We've changed.
Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay. So I'm hoping that each of you can just, and you don't have to follow the slide exactly, but just kind of give our audience what you see as kind of the big 2 or 3 takeaways here that they should go back and start thinking about right now.
So I could start, Regina. So I mean, just looking at the stats, and which is what I tried to do, you know, with the initial slides, because it's easy for us to just talk about these issues, but to have the statistics is important. So, you know, the study that McKinsey has done, I think, is groundbreaking. If they continue to do that study, diverse and inclusive businesses are just becoming more and more likely to outperform their competitors. And it's not, and the penalty to not being diverse and inclusive is growing as well. So that's point 1. Point 2, I think, is that our legal profession is not diverse and inclusive enough. I think that's the reality. The trends are improving, but the numbers are not good enough. Don't conflate diversity and inclusion. You know, they're not interchangeable ideas. You know, it's, you know, diversity is you know, the numbers, right? It is who you bring in. Inclusion is the ability to make sure that these folks are successful. And that's really the key. It's giving them the tools to succeed, and you know, that is a deliberate step that companies need to take in order to provide those tools.
Regina?
I agree with Eugene. I'll emphasize again, it's diversity and inclusion are not interchangeable, and inclusion is your culture. And without the culture, you're not going to retain diverse candidates if you're able to hire them. And you're not going to be able to hire them because people are going to be looking at you and saying, okay, what happens with people like me in your firm? Do we succeed? Do we move up the ladder? So inclusion is the culture.
And just one thing, just a question from me. It's my sense is that the bar as a whole has a diversity issue. You know, we're talking a lot about law firms, and law firms obviously can move things forward. But do either of you have any thoughts on that? What the bar as a whole can do?
Be proactive. Go out and not just wait until people graduate from law school and take the bar. Go into law schools. You know, start relationships with attorneys and law students. Be more proactive about going out and finding diverse candidates. We've started to do that in Maine. I think that is what we really need to do. When you're in a city like Massachusetts or Boston that's not that diverse, or a state like Maine that's not that diverse, you've got to look for it. You've got to go out and proactively find diverse candidates. And that's not just going to be in the market. You've got to cultivate them years in advance of when you're going to. This is a long-term project, so you've got to cultivate them years in advance.
I think that's an interesting point. So I want to, we don't have any more questions, so I want to thank Eugene and Regina for presenting today. I want to thank Beryl for sponsoring again this year, which we very much appreciate. Thank Nelson Mullins for sponsoring the earlier program. Remind everyone that a copy of the presentation will be going out to everybody by email, and that you can view this program again using the link. Thank everybody for coming, and I'm going to invite Camilla back to say a few last words.
Oops, where'd you go?
Can you see my screen?
We can.
Oh, there we go. Thank you all. Thank you to the speakers for sharing and continuing to champion D&I efforts in all of your respective firms. Also, thank you to everyone who participated in the questions and just being here today. So please check out masslawyersweekly.com and colormagazine.com for upcoming events for 2021. And from all of us here, thank you for attending the event and wishing you a safe and healthy holiday season.
Yes, have a wonderful holiday season, stay safe, and we very much look forward to seeing you all next year, hopefully in a live environment. Thank you again to all of our presenters and our sponsors.